Hello, friend. Welcome to History ZZZ. We are glad you are here. Get comfortable. Find your position. Let your body be heavy. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands unclench. Breathe in slowly and out. Tonight is different from our other nights together. Most nights, we travel to a place that history has explained, a city, an empire, a moment we understand at least in outline, at least enough to name. Tonight we travel to a place history has never fully explained. We go to a slope in the northern Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. The year is 1959. It is February, deep winter, the coldest kind. The temperature on the open slopes will fall to 30 degrees below 0 Celsius, maybe lower. 9 people are up there tonight. They are experienced, they are prepared. They have done this before. Something happens. We do not know what. We have never known what. Close your eyes. We are going to the mountain. First, you should know who they were. They were not soldiers. They were not spies. They were not adventurers chasing fame. They were students, mostly, from the Ural Polytechnic Institute in the city of Sverdlovsk. Young people in their early 20s, the kind who spent their weekends doing things that made their parents nervous. Their leader was Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, a fifth-year student in radio engineering. He had designed and built his own radio equipment that the group would carry into the mountains. He was methodical, careful, experienced. There was Zinaida Kolmogorova, Zina, 22, warm-tempered and beloved by the group. Rustam Slobodin, 23, an engineer already working at a closed facility. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, both 21, inseparable friends who worked at the same plant. Lyudmila Dubinina, 20 years old, the youngest and perhaps the most determined. Alexander Zolotaryov was older, 37, a war veteran and experienced outdoorsman who had only recently joined the group. He brought a camera, 9 people in total, after one member turned back early with a bad knee. They said goodbye and went into the wilderness. They were in good spirits. The expedition left Sverdlovsk on January 25th. Their goal was Otorten, a mountain whose name, in the language of the local Mansi people, means something like "do not go there." This was not considered an omen at the time. Place names are old. They carry old reasons that are no longer remembered. The group traveled north by train and then by truck, reaching a logging settlement called Ivdel, and then pushing further into the wilderness. The roads became tracks and the tracks became nothing. They were aiming to complete a Category 3 hike, the most difficult rating in the Soviet classification system, in winter, through a region known for its sudden storms and brutal wind. They carried everything they needed: food for 16 days, tents and sleeping bags, skis, a portable stove, a Morse code transmitter. They photographed themselves along the way. These photographs still exist. You can find them now. Grainy, black and white images of young people laughing, squinting into the cold sun, posing dramatically on their skis. They look like anyone at the beginning of an adventure. They look like people who expect to come home. The mountains received them without ceremony. They kept a group diary. This is one of the things we know. They wrote in it together, passing it around, adding observations and jokes and small complaints the way groups do on long journeys. The last entry was made on January 31st. It is unremarkable. The weather was difficult, winds picking up, visibility dropping as they moved higher. The group had cached some supplies at a lower elevation to reduce their load for the summit push. On February 1st, they began to ascend the slope of Kolatshiakl, in the Mansi language, Dead Mountain. This was not Otorten, their intended destination. They had drifted off course in low visibility. Realizing this, Dyatlov made a decision. Rather than descend and lose altitude, they would camp on the slope and continue in the morning. They pitched their tent on the open slope at roughly 1,100 meters elevation. The wind was constant. The temperature was falling. They had good equipment. They were experienced enough to handle a night on an exposed slope. The diary entries up to this point are calm, almost cheerful. This is the last night anyone can account for with certainty. After this, there is only what was found. Breathe slowly. Let the weight of your body sink down. When the group failed to return by February 12th, their expected date, no one was immediately alarmed. Mountain trips run late. Conditions change. Experienced hikers know how to adapt. But a week passed, then another. On February 20th, a search party was organized. They followed the group's known route north from Ivdel. On February 26th, 25 days after the group had made camp on Kholat Sokol, the searchers found the tent. It was still standing, more or less, half buried in snow that had accumulated since the group had pitched it. The tent poles had partially collapsed under the weight. But the tent had not simply been abandoned. It had been cut open. From the inside, multiple cuts made with a knife from inside the tent, large enough for a person to push through. From outside, the tent looked intact. The cuts were not visible until you pulled the fabric apart. Someone inside that tent had cut their way out, in a hurry. The searchers looked inside. The hikers' belongings were all there. Food, clothing, boots, everything they would have needed to survive. The tent was empty. The footprints led away from the tent, down the slope, toward the tree line about 1.5 kilometers below. The searchers followed them carefully. The tracks were visible in the compressed snow, at least 8 sets of prints, sometimes overlapping, sometimes moving in parallel. What the tracks showed was deeply strange. The group had left the tent without their boots, without their coats. In temperatures that were already far below zero and falling further as the night deepened. Some of them were in socks. One was barefoot. Most were in whatever they had been sleeping in, thermal underwear, light shirts. They had not panicked in a way that made them run. The footprints were not scrambled or chaotic. They had walked, more or less together, down the slope in the dark. This too is deeply strange. In extreme cold, the human instinct is to huddle, to stay near shelter, near anything warm, to move toward protection, not away from it. These 9 people had walked away from their tent, away from their supplies, away from warmth, into the open darkness of a winter mountainside. Whatever had caused them to do this had not left a trace the searchers could find. They followed the tracks into the trees. The first 2 bodies were found near a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest. Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko, 21 years old, both of them. They were wearing almost nothing. The cedar tree was scorched. A fire had been built here. Small, inadequate, burning branches snapped from the tree. The boys had climbed the tree. Broken branches showed where they had gone up as high as 5 meters, looking for something perhaps, or to get away from something below. Their hands were burned, not from the fire exactly, from holding burning branches in bare hands to try to keep the flame alive. The fire they had built was not big enough to warm anyone. A proper fire built by experienced winter campers would have been larger, more sheltered. This fire was the fire of people who had very little left to work with. The 2 young men were found in positions that suggested they had died where they fell. The cause of death, hypothermia. This, at least, was answerable. What was not answerable was why they were there, why they had left the tent. Why, with a tent full of warm clothing less than a mile and a half away, they had died in the snow under a burned cedar tree wearing almost nothing. The searchers marked the location and kept looking. Between the cedar tree and the tent, on the slope, 3 more bodies were found. Igor Dyatlov himself was found roughly 300 meters from the cedar. He was lying on his back in the snow, one arm raised slightly as if bracing against something. His face was turned toward the tent. Zinaida Kolmogorova, Zina, was found further up the slope. She was on her stomach in the snow, her hands bearing the signs of a fight, abrasions, wounds consistent with trying to grip or push against something. The medical examiners concluded she had fought to survive longer than almost anyone else. She had tried to crawl back up to the tent. Rustam Slobodin was found between them. He had a fracture in his skull, a crack about 13 centimeters long. The examiners said it was not, in their judgment, the cause of death. He had died of hypothermia, as the others had, but the fracture was there. 5 bodies in the snow, 5 people who had walked away from shelter and died in the cold, 4 of them with no injuries that could explain why they had left, 1 with a fracture that the examiners could not fully explain. The remaining 4 were not found yet. It would take until May. Let your breathing grow slow and deep. You are safe. The 4 remaining members of the group were found in May when the snow began to melt. They had not been on the open slope. They had gone deeper, past the cedar tree, further into the forest, to a ravine where a small stream ran beneath the snow. They were found under 4 meters of accumulated snow. Alexander Zolotaryov, Lyudmila Dubinina, Nikolai Chibo-Brignoles, Alexander Kolevatov. These 4 were more warmly dressed than the others found earlier. In the weeks between the first 5 being found and the snow melting, investigators had puzzled over the underdressed bodies near the cedar. Now they understood, at least partially. Someone had taken clothing from the first to die and given it to the others. There were signs of a makeshift shelter, cut branches, attempts to build something against the cold. These 4 had tried to survive longer. They had organized, adapted, worked, and still they had died. But the cause of death and the nature of their injuries would change everything about the investigation. When the examiners reached the bodies, they stopped. 3 of the 4 found in the ravine had injuries that defied explanation. Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles had severe skull fractures, not a crack, but a full crushing trauma to the head. Lyudmila Dubinina and Alexander Zolotaryov had broken ribs, not 1 or 2, but multiple bilateral fractures. Both sides of the chest, multiple ribs, shattered inward. The lead medical examiner compared the force required to something like a car accident, like being struck by a vehicle moving at speed or falling from a very great height. But there were no external wounds, no bruising on the skin consistent with a blow of that magnitude, no lacerations, no marks on the surface that could indicate what force had been applied and from where. The internal trauma was there. The external evidence was not. In a courtroom, this would be called inexplicable. In a medical examiner's report, it was called unexplained. The investigators wrote it down, noted it with professional care, and had no answer to offer. Whatever had broken those ribs from inside a human body without leaving a mark on the skin had never been seen before in a forensic examination in this region. Perhaps anywhere. And then there was Lyudmila Dubinina, 20 years old. Dubinina had the internal injuries, the broken ribs, the chest trauma. She also had something else. Her tongue was missing. Her eyes were gone. The examiners also noted the absence of her lips and significant soft tissue damage to her face. The official explanation was decomposition. She had been in running water beneath snow for months. The flowing stream and bacterial activity, it was said, could account for the soft tissue loss. Some researchers have accepted this. The forensics of bodies found in running water can produce exactly this kind of damage. Others have not accepted it. They note that a tongue is a large muscle, well protected inside the mouth, and that decomposition alone rarely causes it to simply disappear while other tissue remains. They note that the injuries, combined with her other trauma, suggest something that did not behave like ordinary decomposition. Alexander Zolotaryov, found nearby, was also missing his eyes. The investigators noted this. They offered the same explanation. Whether you accept the explanation depends perhaps on how much you need one. Breathe in and out. There was also the matter of the radiation. This came to light not in the original investigation, but in the documents that were eventually declassified decades after the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Several of the hikers' clothing items tested positive for radioactive contamination. Not all of them. Specific garments, particularly those belonging to Krivonishenko and Dubinina. The levels were described as elevated but not immediately dangerous. Not the kind of radiation that would kill quickly, but contamination that should not have been there. There were, in this region in 1959, Soviet military installations engaged in nuclear weapons development. Krivonishenko, one of the first two found at the cedar tree, had worked at a facility near Chelyabinsk, a plant involved in the production of nuclear material. Some investigators have suggested the contamination came from his work clothes. Residue from an ordinary occupational exposure that had nothing to do with the Urals. Others have noted the proximity of known military testing sites. The Soviet authorities, when asked directly, said nothing useful. The radiation is there in the record. It has been confirmed by multiple sources over the decades. What it means, if anything, has never been definitively answered. Another thing written down and left without resolution. The Soviet investigation was closed in May of 1959, 3 months after the tent was found. The official conclusion was this: the cause of death of the hikers was an elemental force which they were unable to overcome. Some translations render this as an unknown compelling force. The case was classified. The files were sealed. The families of the 9 were told very little. They were discouraged from asking questions. The area around Kolatsiakl was closed to hikers for 3 years. This too has never been fully explained. In the Soviet Union of 1959, the closing of a case was not unusual. The classifying of files was not unusual. The discouragement of grieving families from making noise about government conclusions was not unusual. And yet, 9 experienced Soviet citizens had died under circumstances the state's own investigators could not explain. And the state's response was to seal the file and tell people to stop asking. To some, this suggests something to hide. To others, it suggests only that the Soviet state found embarrassment and uncertainty equally intolerable. The mountain kept its silence. Let your body grow heavier. Let the questions drift. For decades, the Dyatlov Pass incident was known only inside the Soviet Union, and even there, only to those who looked. The case was not widely known in the West until researchers began publishing in the 1990s and 2000s, as Soviet archives were opened and survivors of the search parties were permitted finally to speak. What emerged from those testimonies was a picture of a scene that even experienced search and rescue veterans found deeply disturbing. One searcher described the expression on the faces of the first bodies as unlike anything hypothermia produces. Hypothermia victims, in his experience, often look peaceful in death. These did not. Another described the color of some of the skin, a deep orange-brown that was documented in photographs and has never been satisfactorily explained. Radiation, decomposition, a reaction to extreme cold. The examiners noted it and offered no firm conclusion. A local Mansi guide who accompanied the early searches refused to go to the slope itself. He would go to the tree line, no further. He did not explain why. He did not need to. The theories began almost immediately. They have never stopped. The first and perhaps most persistent natural explanation is an avalanche, or more specifically, a type of delayed snow slab release that could have struck the tent while the hikers slept, causing panic and forcing a rapid exit through the tent walls. Proponents of this theory note that the injuries, the crushed ribs, the fractured skull, are consistent with being struck by a wave of compressed snow. The external wounds problem is addressed by noting that snow, unlike rock or metal, can transmit enormous kinetic force through the body's interior while leaving the skin relatively undamaged. The Russian government officially endorsed a version of this theory in 2019, 60 years after the deaths. Critics of the avalanche theory note several problems. The slope angle where the tent was pitched is generally considered below the threshold for avalanche formation. No evidence of avalanche debris was found at the site. The footprints leading away from the tent were not disturbed by snow movement. And if it was an avalanche, why did 9 experienced hikers, trained for winter conditions, run from the tent without any equipment? An avalanche, if survivable, is survivable inside a tent, not on an open slope in 30 below zero wind. Another theory involves infrasound. In certain mountain conditions, particularly with specific wind patterns over irregular terrain, standing waves of very low frequency sound can form below the threshold of human hearing, but not below the threshold of human feeling. Infrasound at certain frequencies can produce disorientation, intense unease, hallucination, and in extreme cases, a panic response so severe that people flee without being able to articulate what they are fleeing from. It has been reproduced in laboratory conditions. Subjects exposed to strong infrasound have described feeling as if something is in the room, that something terrible is about to happen, a sense of presence, a physical conviction of danger with no visible source. The tent was pitched on an open slope in the lee of a ridge in high wind. The conditions for infrasound generation were present. Critics note that infrasound, while genuinely unsettling, does not cause internal injuries. It does not explain crushed ribs. But perhaps it does not need to. Perhaps what drove 9 people from their tent in the dark is separate from what killed them after they had already fled. Perhaps there were 2 things, and only the second left evidence. Breathe deeply. Let the thoughts slow. There is a military theory. In 1959, the Soviet military was conducting active tests of various weapons in the Ural region. Parachute mines, vacuum bombs, weapons that work by compression wave, killing through internal injury while leaving the external body intact, the radiation on the clothing, the internal injuries without external wounds, the sealed files, the closed area, the silence. Witnesses in the region in February of 1959 reported seeing glowing orbs in the sky on multiple nights. These reports were not from the search parties. They came from other towns, other witnesses, independently. The Soviet military said nothing then. They say nothing now. The problem with the military theory is that it requires believing that a weapon test accidentally struck a group of civilian hikers, and that rather than investigate, the state chose to bury the evidence and let 9 young people's families live with an unknown compelling force for the rest of their lives. Which is, of course, entirely possible. This is the Soviet Union in 1959. That is not an implausible thing for it to have done. The Mansi people have lived in the northern Urals for centuries. Kholat-Syakhl, Dead Mountain, was not a casual name. The Mansi did not name places carelessly. According to some accounts, the mountain had a long tradition of being considered dangerous. Not just difficult terrain, not just weather. There are stories, and the line between history and story is never as clear as we would like, of previous deaths on that slope, of people who went up and did not come back, of animals that refused to approach. The Mansi were initially investigated as suspects in the Soviet inquiry. The hikers had been in territory the Mansi considered their own. There was a theory, briefly, that the group had been killed in a conflict over land. This theory was abandoned. The evidence did not support it. The Mansi cooperated with the investigation, but the Mansi guide who would not go past the tree line was not alone in his reluctance. There is something the local knowledge of the northern Urals holds about that particular mountain that has never been translated into a form that satisfies a forensic investigator. It is not evidence, but it is something. In 2019, the Russian government reopened the case. A team of investigators reviewed all available evidence, traveled to the site, and issued a report. Their conclusion, a small localized snow slab, not a full avalanche, had slid over the tent while the group slept, causing panic and forcing an emergency exit. The injuries were consistent with compression by snow. The flight from the tent was survival instinct under extreme disorientation. The families of the 9 were not fully satisfied. Neither were many of the researchers who had spent decades studying the case. The slope angle problem remains, the lack of debris remains, the undisturbed footprints remain. The case was reclosed. 60 years, 3 months, and the official answer is still, essentially, they were killed by the mountain. Which may be true. Mountains do kill people. The Urals in February are not forgiving. But the mountain doesn't usually leave its victims with crushed ribs and no bruises, with a missing tongue, with traces of radiation, with footprints walking calmly away. The mountain killed them, perhaps. The question is, what was the mountain doing? The night is deep now. Your body is heavy. There is one final thing to hold. Among the last photographs recovered from the group's cameras was a frame from Krivonashenko's camera that has never been satisfactorily explained. It appears to show a series of blurred light sources, orbs or columns of light, photographed at night from a moving or shaking camera. The image is dark and indistinct. It could be stars, it could be a fire, it could be equipment malfunction, it could be something else. The camera was found near the cedar tree where Krivonashenko died. He had photographed something in the dark before or during whatever drove the group from the tent. What he photographed, what he saw, what made him raise a camera in the middle of a survival emergency, we do not know. He is not here to tell us. None of them are. The mountain does not speak. The file is closed. The snow falls, as it has every winter since 1959, on the slope of Kholat-Syakhl. And the questions remain, each one buried just a little deeper with every new layer. Sleep is very close. Let it come. Dyatlov Pass is the name we use now. They named it for the group's leader after the tragedy, a permanent acknowledgement that this is where Igor Dyatlov went and did not return. Kolatsiakl, Dead Mountain, remains the older name. The mountain itself has not changed. It is still there, 1,100 meters above sea level, a moderate slope by any technical measure. Nothing about its terrain that should set it apart from 1,000 other mountain slopes in the Urals. Hikers still go there. There is a memorial on the mountain now, a metal plaque and a small monument to the 9 who died in February 1959. People photograph themselves next to it. They leave flowers in summer. They stand and look at the slope where the tent was pitched and try to imagine what the night must have felt like. The slope reveals nothing. The sky is blue on good days, gray on bad ones. The wind comes off the ridge the same way it always has. 9 people are still missing from the world, in the sense that their full story has never been returned to it. The mountain keeps it. Perhaps it always will. Sleep now, let the mountain be. This is the nature of an unsolved mystery, not a puzzle waiting for the right piece, not a locked door with a key hidden somewhere, just a gap in the record of what happened, a gap shaped exactly like 9 people on the night of February 1st into 2nd, 1959. We have filled that gap with theories, with science, with speculation, with wishful explanations and dark ones. None of them close the gap entirely. And that is the thing about unsolved mysteries that is both frustrating and in its own way worth sitting with. Not everything that happened has been explained. Not everything that matters has been understood. The world contains events that resist accounting. This is uncomfortable if you need the world to be fully legible. If you need every death to have a named cause, every disappearance to have a resolution. But perhaps there is another way to hold it. Perhaps the gap in the record is simply what honesty looks like sometimes. We don't know. We have said so. 9 people went to a mountain and did not come back. We remember them. That much at least is certain. Sleep. History ZZZ.